Welcome to the Intuition Incubator. I am super excited to invite my guest, Noah Tetzner. After growing Noah's first show to 50,000 downloads a month within 5 months of launch, at the age of 16, Noah Tetzner decided to make podcasting his life's work. He has grown, monetized, and produced podcasts for Alibaba, Facebook, Siemens Energy, New York Times bestselling authors, and more. Noah's mission is to help entrepreneurs get more clients and grow a massive audience. Welcome, Noah.
I'm so excited to be here with you, Abby. Thank you for having me.
Oh my gosh, I'm excited too. Full disclosure, Noah actually is the producer of my podcast. For better or for worse, any complaints you can send to him. But I wanted to have Noah on this podcast because, as we know, this is all about plugging into that inner voice, that intuition. And as Noah and I have talked about, and as if you've listened to any of my work, I talk a lot about how we are conditioned to kind of operate from the neck up, only from this thinking center of the brain. And a lot of our programming and conditioning, unfortunately, has us separating from what really is our deeper knowing, our intuition. We have devalued that part of ourselves. And so this podcast is all about refinding that. And I call it incubating it because we really need to put it back into an incubator, because sometimes we have no idea what we're really feeling or thinking. We're just walking around our lives in unalignment in one area or another: relationship, business, health and wellness. And I'm excited to have you here, Noah, because as a very young man, you have started this journey, and I think you have a really relatable and interesting story around the programming that you grew up with, how at some point it sort of was in misalignment. You had some awakenings, and then really have a great story around, we'll get to later, but the natural pitfalls that we have happen when that happens. So I would love it if you would begin by telling our audience a little bit about your upbringing and the programming that your soul entered into in your family of origin.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you, Abby. So I, born and raised in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and I grew up in the quintessential Christian, conservative, middle-class, suburbia family. I mean, and I know a lot of people can probably relate to that. My parents, have been married for like 25 years, great marriage. And I was raised in the church, and, mom was a homemaker, stay-at-home mom. She homeschooled my sister and I, and my dad is a small business owner. He's a real estate appraiser. So, overall, it was kind of this like picturesque upbringing on the outside, right? Like I said, middle class, very evangelical family, raised in the church. And one of the things that I am thankful for, although, it wasn't without its, negative aspects, unfortunately, being raised in the church was that aspect of community. I'm so thankful that even though it was a little bit tainted growing up, I was a part of a community. You know what I mean? That there were these families that were really close to our family. And I had these groups of friends that from, ages 5 until really 18, I grew up with and did life with. So I never really, on the outside, I wasn't alone, but I always felt lonely. And so that was very much how my upbringing looked. The fact that I was homeschooled was also really, I would say, impactful. I would say, just a personal opinion, for some people, homeschooling's great. For some people, it isn't so great. For me, it was wonderful. I've always been kind of a self-starter. And especially when I got into those older high school years, homeschooling allowed me the time and flexibility to pursue my passion, which was history and podcasting. So I started my first podcast just as a hobby when I was 16. And I was, living with my parents, just started a show. And, in terms of what I was doing, schoolwork, it was really loose and really flexible. Some might even call that sort of unschooling. But I'm so grateful for that. And it all worked out. So there were some good aspects of that too. But as I grew up, right? As I grew up and I started to really like connect with myself and connect with my identity and who I am and the things that interest me outside of that programming, I realized that some of what I became really interested in didn't necessarily align with the upbringing that I received. So that's like a super high level overview, Abby, of kind of, the family life that I had growing up.
Yeah. Okay, great. So one of the things that I heard you say, which of course is such a clue for us when we are recognizing that we're not aligning with something. As you said, you were always around a lot of people, but you felt lonely. And that is so relatable. I know I felt that growing up myself for different reasons, but it's so relatable. And of course, we tend to take that on ourselves, right? Like there must be something wrong with me. You mentioned though that, so as went on, you realized that some things were kind of out of alignment. And I'd love for you to speak into that and really what that was like for you when you first began to recognize that it wasn't just that it wasn't just there's something wrong with you, or maybe that's how at first it showed up for you.
Yeah.
What was that like? Because, to have a family that's super, super into something that you are not as into can be extremely painful.
Yeah, that's such a good question, Abby. So for me, I always felt like the black sheep of certainly my own family, but our community growing up. I was that homeschooled kid, that kind of nerdy, geeky, funny homeschool kid that was liked by everybody, but didn't necessarily have any best friends or deep relationships with people. And then as I got older, I struggled with low self-esteem. I, was bullied. I struggled with my weight. I struggled with my body image and that sort of thing. And that was really hard. And I never really had any semblance of self. Like I was not self-actualized at all. I had no idea who I was. My only concept of who I was how other people interpreted me. Oh, people like me, or people like it when I do this or say this, so that must be right. I need to do more of that to be accepted. And one of the things that my parents did growing up that I think in many ways was a silver bullet for my upbringing is they got me and my sister really involved with community theater in Green Bay, where I grew up. And that was wonderful. That was wonderful. And that experience couldn't have been more different than, sort of the like very structured religious, upbringing I had outside of the theater. And I love that world. I love that world so much because here you have a cast of people of all different ages, of all different socioeconomic levels and backgrounds coming together and creating something. It was beautiful. It was beautiful. It's like we were all putting our energy into one thing, and it brought people so much joy. I remember I was 18 and I played Shrek in Shrek the Musical of all things. And they just opened a theater in Green Bay. And the max capacity was like 120 people. It was kind of like a small dinner and a show type theater. And opening night of that show, they sold out. And I just remember like the magic that we created that night. It was the best feeling. So thankfully I had that. And, the older I got, the more that I sort of realized that the things I was interested in and the things that I was drawn to didn't align with, again, that upbringing. So when I was 16, I started my first podcast. It was about history, and it really took off. I was just doing it as kind of a hobby, and within 5 months, 50,000 people were tuning in every month. Yeah. And that, for the first time, gave me like something that was my own, because nobody I mean, everybody thought it was kind of weird. I remember telling like friends and family members about my podcast, and they just kind of dismissed it as, oh, you're doing a podcast about history and Vikings of all things. That's random. But what I noticed is that was something that I did for me. I'd always been a history buff. So I finally had like an outlet where I could express myself. And it was kind of the same effect of being involved with community theater. It's like I could express myself as myself. And as time went on and that podcast became more successful, all of a sudden I started working with people and helping them with their podcasts. And from a young age, I established financial freedom. I remember I had like my first 6-figure year as a business owner when I was 18. And that was wonderful because I'm like, holy cow, like I have this independence and stability. I can really kind of run on my own. And, it was in that moment that I finally felt like I could sort of be myself, So,
yeah.
But yeah, that concept of like being surrounded by people, but feeling very lonely, that was my whole life until really I got into podcasting. And it was weird because the people and the friends that I made through podcasting, the clients, colleagues, it's like I had deeper relationships with those people, right? Like than I did sort of my own like friends and family,
Family of choice, right? We call that family of choice. And so many of us have that, right? And it's so, so very important. One of the things that I love about what you said is that when you got into this theater and when you got into podcasting, it sounds like you were really like, that's where you felt most alive.
Yeah.
Naturally. That's just, you were naturally in flow. You now were out of that part of you that's like thinking, well, this is the right thing to do. Or like you said earlier, like people like this, so I should do this. All of a sudden you were in a very, very different space.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what was it like? It sounds like that there wasn't a lot of friction there because that was kind of accepted. It was fine. That was good. You were successful. What was sort of the next hurdle for you when you came up against finding yourself at odds with maybe your intuition or your inner voice or your inner knowing?
Yeah, it's interesting for me, Abby, because this concept of intuition is something I've always thought a lot about. And I consider myself a spiritual person. And one of the things I realized is that growing up, I think I've always been an intuitive person from a young age. But the question that I didn't even contemplate until I was much older is what is that? Like, what is intuition? And as somebody who grew up in the church, well, it must be God. That must be the conviction of the Holy Spirit, right?
Yeah.
And I remember when I was sort of like, early on sort of in my spiritual journey, I think I was 18. I remember I had a session with a psychic, and that was the first time I had ever done anything like that, and that was kind of like me being a rebel at the same time.
Yeah.
And, I'm sure people tuning in have mixed, reviews and thoughts on that. And I'm certainly not projecting anything. But I remember for me, one of the first things she told me is, she's like, Noah, you've always been an intuitive person. And you've always called that trusting your gut. That's in your head, what you've called it. And it's like she took the words right out of my mouth. I've always had like this gut feeling, this sense of something. And I was so young at the time. I was only 18, and I have really on paper lived kind of a sheltered life. So that couldn't have been past experience. You know what I mean?
Yes. It came from something higher.
It came from something higher, and it came from something outside of myself,
Mm-hmm.
So that moment was really transformational. That's when I started to think about intuition, and I discovered that, hey, one of the things that I love about myself is I'm not always right, but I can trust my gut. I have this intuition that in many ways guides me, and it's certainly helped me through some of the darkest moments of my life. So so yeah, I mean, that's that was one transformational moment. And then as I got older, I really made my identity my hyperachiever saboteur, because that's what I could control.
Yeah. And before you
Please.
go there, right? Because I think what you're making a leap between now is you had this knowing that you have this gut intuition. You had an awareness inside yourself, like, I have a true north.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, it sounds like what you're about to tell us is the journey of abandoning that true north.
Yeah.
The abandoning of that, of understanding that. So yeah. So tell us, what that looked like, and then I'll ask you how you became aware of that.
Yeah. No, that's great. The older I got, it was like, between the ages of like 16, so it would have been like 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, I just went full in with hyperachiever. I put all of my time, energy, and focus into my business. I got a really nice apartment, moved out of my parents' house. I was independent. I was, going to like 4 to 5 different countries per year traveling. It was great. Wow. And I loved it, right? And because it was like, man, this is something I'm finally good at. Like, I've never been the most physically fit person. Theater was so much fun, but I just kind of like grew out of that at the time. So this is like finally something that I can make my identity, is the fact that I'm a professional and I'm a good businessman and I have relationships with clients all over the world. So I really put so much energy into that. And when I did that, I lost myself, unfortunately.
Because that's not intuitive.
That's not intuitive at all. And I actually got goosebumps once you teed up this question, Abby, because I'm like, man, you're good, because that's exactly what happened.
Right.
But, so it wasn't intuitive at all. So I went, and one of the things that I should say that may or may not be relevant to listeners is, I've been doing so much inner work over the last year, especially. And one of the things that I realized is, I was raised in a middle-class family, but I grew up around a lot of wealthy, affluent families. I was homeschooled, but I also did a few years at a Christian private school. And a lot of the common denominator between the homeschooling families and the private school families that, we were friends with is they really came from sort of a lot of money. And I'm for abundance. There's nothing wrong with that. But I should note that was very much a part of my upbringing. And then naturally in the theater world, all of those students who were my age that were enrolled in those programs, it was like the extracurricular thing that some of the affluent families in our neighborhood did. And they sent their kids to that. And I experienced some bullying. I was bullied for my weight. I was bullied for my appearance. I had horrendous acne as a kid. Looking back, it's sort of nothing extraordinary. I think a lot of people, unfortunately, experience bullying. But that really, really hurt me. So my brain, I don't know how I drew this conclusion, but one of the things my brain did is it said, man, I'm being bullied by these kids who, they're 18 and their parents are buying them, their first car. And it's like this, this luxury vehicle, this Mercedes or BMW, totally maxed out. I'm being bullied by these kids. So what I need to do is, I might not be as physically fit as them, but the one thing I can do is I can become a successful businessman.
Yes.
And so that, as I went down this hyperachievement rabbit hole, that was in the back of my mind, is trying to, you know what I mean? Trying to put all of my worth in that. So that's one thing I'll mention.
Relatable and so unconscious. And I think it's just worth highlighting for the listeners, for all of us that have that hyperachiever saboteur. It's really hard to catch, because our society really values that, right? And there's just all good things coming from it. You're getting more notoriety, more, fortune, all of these things. And when you love what you do, as you did and I do, it's really hard sometimes to recognize when the motive for what we're doing is subconsciously, I mean, not that we wouldn't do it anyway or we don't love it, but subconsciously the driver that's driving us is this, I'm going to get back at these guys. I'm going to be better than, my worth is attached to this. And when we can't root that out, you know, we are out of alignment with our intuition. We are out of ease and flow. And ultimately, you know, we burn out, we melt down, and there's some kind of come to Jesus, you know, sorry, lack of a better term, that is brewing, that's about to happen.
And so that's exactly what happened is those next few years from, again, ages like 18 to 22, I was just, you know, working constantly. My dad had an office in downtown Green Bay that he didn't use anymore for his business. So he let me work out of his office, and I would, you know, go there at like 6 a.m., get started, wouldn't leave until like 8 p.m., just working constantly. And I loved what I did, and it was my escape from the world. So because I was putting so much energy and attention into that, my business grew year after year after year after year, and new opportunities started presenting themselves. And I remember it was 2022, and I just felt like king of the hill. I had, you know, so much abundance, and I had my best financial year ever. And I kind of looked around and I was like, man, I'm really lonely. Like I don't have deep relationships with people at all. I have friends, which mainly consisted of me taking people out to dinner and buying them drinks and trying to win people's, you know, love and affection through those types of things. And I wasn't conscious of that either. I just thought, oh yeah, you know, I love to give to people. I've always been a generous person and still am. But looking back, one of the things I was trying to do is buy and prove myself to people, you know, their affection.
Wow. And let me just honor for a moment the courage that it takes to say that, and the insight that is required to be able to become aware of that. Because I so honor you saying that, because the truth is we are all doing this crazy shit. We are all duplicitous in this way. There's nothing unique, you know, audience, about what Noah is sharing, you know, and if you're having a reaction to it, it's like, oh, I would never do that. I challenge you, because this is what our minds do. This is part of the whole game of how we get separated from our intuition and how we are inauthentic inadvertently, even when our deepest desire is to be so. So sorry for interrupting, but I just really wanted to honor that.
Thank you for that. I feel that. So I was looking around and noticed I didn't have deep relationships with people. So of course, what did I do? But just thought, oh, if I achieve even more, things will get better, right? And I had this thought pattern where I thought, you know, Noah, you're a successful guy. You know, like you're doing financially pretty well. You've wrote some books. You have significance in the form of recognitions and, you know, letters after your name or what have you, but nobody really knows who you are. Like, you know, walking down the street, nobody really knows who you are. So I thought to myself, man, maybe if I get involved with the local politics of my hometown, that will give me more significance. And I don't know why I was drawn to that. I've never been a political person. In many ways, I consider myself kind of apolitical, but I've always liked history. So maybe there's some sort of subconscious correlation there. But I had a connection to a state legislator in Wisconsin, a friend of a friend, and I took him out for coffee, and I really invested in that relationship. You know, he became my mentor. I would do things for him. I donated his campaign. You know, I would campaign on his behalf, and really, I just invested heavily in that relationship because what I wanted to do is during the next spring election cycle, run for city council myself. And of course I did. And that process was so ugly and so dark and so just not healthy in any way, shape, or form. You know, there's just my experience of running for office is that there's just so much ego. There's so much ego. You know what I mean? I mean, a city councilman in my hometown, the salary is $6,000 a year. The salary for a school board member in my hometown is like $2,000 a year. Yet
A year?
A year, per year. Yeah.
Okay.
Yet you would think that these people were, these, these people are some of the most egotistical, just like narcissistic people ever. And it's just a fact. That was my experience. So, just this idea of, I remember I had over 100 yard signs that were bright red and that said, Noah Tetzner for De Pere City Council, District 2, which is a suburb of Green Bay. And I had 2 billboards with my face on it. And I every day was going to some event, some bar, some pints and politics event to shake hands and network with people. And I just absolutely couldn't stand it. I did not feel like myself at all.
And yet you did it.
And yet I did it. I did it.
Yeah.
It was just, it was such a dark time. And one of the things that I realized is just how mean people can be, on both sides of the spectrum. And one of the things I'll say is that, the affiliates that I surrounded myself with, the fundraisers, the elected officials that were, let's just say, on one side of the aisle, and that side of the aisle happened to be supporting my race, I experienced more adversity from those people than I did my opponent or the opposition. Wow. It was very strange. And, another thing I'll say, and this is the last thing I'll say about that journey is, I think everybody can agree that on a national level, there is so much divisiveness and hatred and narcissism in our political process that exists at a local level too, 100%. And I would say to the same intensity in many ways, so it's just, it brings out the worst in people, I think. And I had made that my identity. And I remember I became obsessed with wanting to win that election. I put everything I had into that race. I put thousands of dollars, I put hours of time. And I remember telling people, like, I have to win. And, all the while, mind you, I gained over 50 pounds in 6 months. I was, there was a cigar lounge in Green Bay that I would go to every night with some of my, political buddies. And I thought that if I wore nice clothes and took people out to dinner and smoked cigars, that's what successful people did, right? Like, that was the image that I look and I cringe when I hear myself say it. But at the time, that's what was going on in my head.
And isn't that so funny how we can do that? We literally can do that and be so separated from our intuition and our inner knowing and our personal alignment and be completely unaware of it. It's shocking. It
is. And so long story short, election day rolls around and I lost the race. I got like 40% of the vote and was just absolutely devastated.
Yeah.
And just kind of licked my wounds, hung out in my apartment, didn't leave much. And then 2 weeks later, it was tax day. And I got a note from my tax advisor saying, Noah, you really weren't tracking your expenses over the last year, which was my best financial year. And you owe the IRS as of today, $44,000. And, it was like my dark night of the soul. I mean, I remember just like the weight of I remember what I was wearing that day. I was wearing this Ralph Lauren polo button-up shirt that I had bought. And I remember it felt so tight on me just because I had kind of let myself go. Like, I just remember every feeling of that moment. I remember exactly where I was. I remember the smells of my house. And that was kind of my dark night of the soul. And that was hard. And somebody told me, I had a friend who was in many ways my spiritual mentor. And her and I talked in the weeks preceding that day. And she said, Noah, rock bottom is such a good place to be because the only place you can go is up. So that was like, the one positive
So true.
thing there. But yeah, I know I just unpacked a ton of info.
Oh my gosh,
but
you've lived because I know there's so much more. Like you've lived a very, quite a life, to date, because I know that one of the other things, you and I came together obviously around when I hired you, but we've had many conversations since then.
Yes.
And I know that even after all of this, or maybe this is what kind of helped lift you out of that dark night of the soul, you became involved with an organization or, whatever you might call it, that really felt at the time like it lifted you up, but ultimately also felt like out of alignment.
Yeah. And as I like, this is such an interesting experience for me, Abby, because this is like one of the first times that I've like been interviewed or had a conversation on a podcast about this. And it's so beautiful. But one of the things I'm realizing is like, we as humans are weird. Like we're not black and white. Like, sometimes, hearing our stories back, it's like, well, the next logical decision would be to do this. But when there's so much programming and different things going on, nothing makes sense. And sometimes there's half truth, sometimes there's double-edged swords. And so I had that kind of dark night of the soul. And I remember I had two friends, and I had two friends who were also clients, and they were involved with this organization that was a men's transformation event in Texas. And it was a Christian organization. And the whole premise of the organization was masculinity. And it's run by somebody who, there's a lot of pseudo psychology going on there, in my opinion. But I went to this event, and for me, it was transformational. I mean, truly, there were a lot of things that I disagreed with around this event, but at the time, it was transformational. And kind of the premise of the event is reconnect to your masculinity. You as a man have an obligation to take ownership and responsibility for everything in your life. And that part resonated with me is, the first step for me in terms of healing and transformation was admitting that everything that happened in life was my fault in a way. I had to take ownership for that. So that was great. But there was a lot of just evangelicalism, and I would say even sort of like bigotry pushed through that. And I became so involved with this organization, and I followed their curriculum and I followed their teachings to a T. And I, started working out and hired a personal trainer. And next thing you know, a year later, I had lost all of the weight I had gained. I had lost 52 pounds, which was wonderful. I totally turned around my financial situation. In fact, my business, had been growing at a rate faster than ever before. But things didn't still feel quite right because I felt like I couldn't be myself. Like I still, at this point, hadn't felt like Noah, like 16-year-old Noah before all the BS. I still felt like I had to be something for other people because they would only like me if I acted this or if I did this. And a lot of it was proving my worth to others. And I became super involved with this organization and kind of rose up the ranks and gained credibility and was that great case study, the poster child for somebody who turned his life around. And so, I had an opportunity to live with two guys who were heavily involved in the organization in Nashville, Tennessee. And so I moved out there, and we kind of had a little bachelor pad. And, they were like, Noah, if you move in with us, we'll take your life to even, greater potential. We'll do life together. We'll work out all the time. We'll
friends you're always looking for, the buddies, the togetherness you're looking for.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Great.
That it did. And it appealed to me. And it was going to be this full circle of moment because we had the next event coming up. And this time I was going to bring my dad so that he could go through the same transformation I had. And I just remember that, being in Nashville was cool because I had made so many friends and met new clients and met new people who didn't have any preconceived notions of me.
Yeah.
So in that respect, I could be my true self. And those people had fallen in love with my true self. Those were the people who I was friends with. So that was cool. But I remember there were a couple different things that happened, Abby, and actually you were transformational during that journey as well. Because, I just remember like feeling so run ragged and so exhausted. And I just had this moment where I was like, wait a minute, Noah, like, you've learned all of these like positive intelligence, like tactics, and you've learned how the human brain works a little bit. You understand what's going on here.
Yeah.
Like, what the hell are you doing here? Like, what are you doing in Nashville? You're not happy. You don't like this. The people who you're living with are judging you and they're making you feel like you're not enough and you never will be enough. And I remember I had a conversation with you, Abby, and I just totally broke down. And thank you for giving me that space to do that.
My pleasure.
And, it gave me the courage to then get out of that and move back to Wisconsin and, cancel the relationships I had with that organization and cancel my tickets and come back home. And it was really hard because I knew that I was leaving behind so many relationships, so many friendships, so much significance, because I was that poster child who followed the program and it was validating, and I was giving up a community. And, one of the things I've been thinking about is this concept of like authenticity, which is a word that's so overused, but I think it's so beautiful, because after I finally had the courage to leave that behind, I finally felt like I'd taken the long way round. But after all these years and the highs and the lows, I finally connected to that authentic Noah. It was like, man, I've been waiting for you, dude. Like,
Yeah. And I remember that conversation, and I remember we were doing a saboteur discovery review.
Yeah.
And you were going through, you explored, you chose to explore the victim saboteur.
Yeah.
And kind of just looking at that, you began to kind of put things together. And I remember, I think we emailed like a couple days later or something. And at that point you were like, yeah, I'm living here and I got to go. You told me I'm not going to be available because I'm going to go to this event with these guys and blah, 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 blah. And then like the next day or 2 days later, you're like, yep, I moved out, told you I'm not going to the event, and I'm going to be in Wisconsin for a few weeks.
Yes.
Like, it was like, and that I think is so how intuition works. It's like something clicks, right? And even though you had the awareness, you're like, what am I doing? It wasn't enough to get you to kind of stop doing it. Mm-hmm. Until you had this sort of elevator down from up in the mind down to the heart, and it was like, oh, wait, why am I doing this? Like there's options for me. Yes. There's other ideas. I can do this. I can do something else.
Yes.
And it takes courage, to get to that point. But when you connect with that inner authenticity, it can be like that, right?
It can. And I had that moment. I remember, I was packing my stuff to leave, the place where I was living in, and it was like 11:30 p.m. and I was going to head out at 9 a.m. the next morning. And I just remember I was like doing some laundry. I remember the moment so vividly. And I was just like, what the hell am I doing here? It was just, those were like the exact words in my head. And I was like, Noah, you have this, I read the book, The Power of Positive Thinking by Norman Vincent Peale when I was younger, and that had a profound impact on my life. And one of the exercises that he would do with his clients is make them write out their, as he called them, list of assets. So they could be physical things, but usually they're relationships and awarenesses and knowledge and understanding that you have. So I remember that night, I just was like going over in my head the list of assets that I had.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, I mean, I have people in Nashville that are really good friends and that care about me. I have people in Wisconsin, and I have new eyes now This isn't serving me anymore. And
Yeah.
the big light bulb moment for me is when I realized that I changed my life. I lost the weight and I learned what I needed to learn.
None of these other things did that for you.
None of these other people did that for me. It was all me. And you know what? I'm grateful for whatever put that organization in my path at the time. But I'm confident that if it wasn't that organization, it would have been something else.
And I love that. I love that because your soul had a journey to go on, right?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So much in this. I feel a memoir coming. It's really, and what is just amazing is how young you are doing this work. And I so appreciate it. I would love to hear for our young listeners, because there are people out there who are not so much on this journey, but they might be able to really relate to the feeling of loneliness or defining their worth in other ways. And they're still kind of believing subconsciously or consciously that it's a problem that they have inside that they're the problem, right?
Yeah.
And I wonder what advice you would have, understanding our programming and how easily we sort of fall asleep and get lulled into what our saboteurs tell us to do and all of this stuff. What piece of advice might you give to someone, a young person such as yourself or anybody really, to find that intuitive knowing, and what pearls of wisdom would you give them so that they would have the courage to actually follow it?
I would say that, first of all, let me just address the topic of loneliness. And I would tell you, listeners, that it has nothing to do with other people. Your feeling of loneliness actually has nothing to do with other people, and it has everything to do with you. Okay? So recognize that. And then the next step is recognize that you are not your mind. Okay? We think that we are our thoughts. If we think a thought, that must be a part of who we are, but we're actually not our minds at all. Many people would even argue that consciousness exists outside of the human body. So I'll just share that. But our brains are like computers. And I know that, Abby, you talk about this a lot. Our brains are like computers. And while human beings have the potential to be geniuses, and we can create masterpieces and build pyramids and create these works of art, at the end of the day, we are giant computers walking around on legs. And in our computers, we're running programs that have been running, depending on how old we are, for sometimes many decades. And those programs were first programmed into our minds at a very young age. So just know that that's kind of what your mind is. So a lot of times we tell ourselves, or we have perceptions or understandings of things that aren't exactly so. That's one thing that I tell people. And, think of it like the Matrix. Like when I struggled with my unworthiness, and I struggled with low self-esteem, that was my programming. And unfortunately, there were events in my past that harmed me and that set up different things. But I just ran with that and made decisions accordingly. Like, that's just how I am. I mean, years after I had experienced bullying as a teenager, I was still operating unconsciously in line with that programming of, I need to prove myself to these boys who bullied me, and they were like 14 at the time. So just be aware of that, because once you recognize that, we have programming, and so do the people that even hurt us and that we interact with, I found when I understood that, it gave me a lot of peace, and it also helped me not to judge people so much. So that's one thing I would say. And the other thing I would say is get really clear, if you can, about what it is that just lights up your world. Like Joseph Campbell said, follow your bliss. What do you just, remember when you were in kindergarten and there was like a field trip the next day, and you stayed up so late the night before the field trip, And then, because you were so excited to go, and you woke up the next morning and you had probably slept horribly. Like you probably didn't get any sleep at all because you were so excited. But you just relished in that, like that feeling of bliss, whatever that is for you, like follow it and just follow it. Don't ask what other people think. Don't even ask if it's possible. Just go for it. Because fortunately that's what I've done with my passion of podcasting and history and everything like that. And I'm so glad I did.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. That's amazing. And I want to just tack on to it. It's a never ending journey, right? Like we don't, and I'm sad to impart, we don't just get rid of unworthiness programs. We don't just get rid of that stuff, like that. We evolve kind of like this, right? So but to have these experiences that we can look back on and say, wait a minute, this seed is now planted. So the next time it comes up around, the next time those personality parts come up around, we have a memory of, wait a minute, I found myself before, I can find myself again.
Yeah.
And I love that about your story, because I feel that a lot of those things have built on themselves and will continue as you continue to, grow and be out there doing what you do. So appreciative to have you today and sharing your story. It's really been phenomenal. And I can't wait to hear, what the listeners think of it, because I think there's just a gajillion pearls of wisdom that you dropped here this evening.
Oh, thank you, Abby. Thank you.
All right, listeners, thank you for listening to this episode of the Intuition Incubator. Please like or subscribe and pass it on if you liked it, particularly those younger folks. I just can't stress enough, the more younger people we can get this information out to, particularly when you have a young man like we have Noah here talking to us that is relatable, the better. The more higher consciousness we're going to have in this world, and the less division and white and black and judgment and all the stuff that Noah referred to that's going on in our world today will be. So until next time.